All right, class. So this is my presentation on the educational issue that I have chose. That issue is the school to prison pipeline. So I'm going to start by just going over a bit about what the problem is, and I will get right into the presentation. So what is the school to prison pipeline? Most of you have probably already heard about this phenomenon. It is widely discussed in the social work community, so if you haven't heard about the phenomenon through the fields, you likely have heard about it in one of your classes. Rather than me sitting here and explaining the whole thing, I'm going to show a short clip that explains it very well with great visuals.
The school to prison pipeline. It's a term that describes how American kids get pushed out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Basically, harsh zero-tolerance policies in schools have led to more suspensions, expulsions, and even in-school arrests. Getting suspended or expelled means more time away from school, and it doesn't take an honor student to figure out that's bad news. In fact, expelled and suspended students are more likely to get held back a grade, end up in juvie, or just drop out altogether. And dropping out of high school makes you 3 times more likely to get arrested. Back in school, forget about hallway monitors. Students these days often have to deal with school police. Minor offenses that might have landed you in the principal's office back in the day can now actually lead to your arrest. Students of color and those with disabilities are disproportionately affected. Black students get expelled 3 times more than their white classmates, while a student with a disability is 2 times more likely to get an out-of-school suspension than everyone else. And it's not because these kids are just bad apples. The Justice Department found that black students got harsher punishments than their white peers for doing the same things. So maybe it's time our education system got schooled?
So with that video clip in mind, just to sort of sum up what the school to prison pipeline is, it's a term that's used to describe the way in which students are often funneled directly from the educational system into the criminal justice system through policies, practices, and procedures that, rather than using restorative discipline, which we'll talk more about later in the presentation, use disciplinary, punitive models. This phenomenon affects different populations disproportionately, something that we'll focus more on later in the presentation, but something that the clip did mention that's key to understanding the phenomenon. Something else the clip mentioned, which I'd like to talk more about now, is zero tolerance policies and how zero tolerance policies have helped to create and perpetuate the school to prison pipeline in the educational system. So zero tolerance policies, and we'll get into the history of these a little bit more in a couple of minutes, but they were created in a response to school violence, and they required schools to use punitive disciplinary measures in response to, originally in response to bringing weapons to school. However, zero tolerance policies have morphed into more than just bringing weapons to school, but they create really harsh disciplinary models for behaviors that are otherwise considered normal developmental behaviors that have been sort of denormalized within the school system. Zero tolerance policies often lead to more suspensions or expulsions as opposed to disciplinary measures that keep students in the school and try to repair behavior from within the school. These policies are crucial to perpetuating the school to prison pipeline because many studies have found that because of the harshness of these policies, they're actually increasing the likelihood that students will drop out of school and will eventually be arrested. I don't want to throw a lot of numbers and figures at you regarding how zero tolerance policies actually affect students in this country, but there are a couple really shocking facts that I want to review just to go over prevalence data and how ubiquitous of a problem this is throughout the United States. So in the 2015-2016 academic school year, it was found that collectively students serving out-of-school suspensions missed over 66 million hours of school time or instruction time. In addition to out-of-school suspensions, the amount of students that are actually brought into police custody or funneled directly into juvenile courts for minor infractions, these figures are also pretty shocking. So studies find that truancy accounts for more than 1/3 of all referrals to the justice system. And between the years of 1995 and 2004, 63% of students referred to juvenile courts for truancy were criminally prosecuted, and 7% of them were detained. So for students or for youth that have appeared in court 3 to 4 times, regardless of the severity of the offense, which we know can be pretty non-severe, almost 53% of them were removed from their home, and nearly 40% of them were detained. So these students are spending less time in school, less time at home, and more time in the criminal justice system. 14% of incarcerated youth are incarcerated due to probation or parole violations, and many of them are due to zero tolerance policies. I think in order to truly fully understand this problem, it's really necessary to understand the history behind it. So I'm just going to do a pretty shortened review here because there's a lot of history going into this. But specifically, when you look at post Brown v. Board, that era of time, as corporal punishment in the school sort of diminished, mostly on a moral level because people realized that corporal punishment was just sort of an outdated, sort of inhumane mode of discipline. So suspension and expulsion started to take its place in the 1960s and 70s. Then by the 80s and 90s, when you think about the political zeitgeist of the time, like the war on drugs, and the way that the war on drugs sort of focused on incarceration and focused on this mindset of crime leads to punishment. Now, in the school system, we know that crime is very loosely defined. So during this time, the educational system actually saw the shift to zero tolerance policies, as the cultural values were also shifting towards more zero tolerance mentalities. Zero tolerance policies, as we sort of reviewed, were also a direct response to gun violence in schools. And zero tolerance laws were actually created in 1994 with the Gun Free Schools Act. This act required all states receiving federal education funds to implement zero tolerance policies that lead directly to the expulsion of any student found bringing a weapon to school. So the ideology behind this was that schools were experiencing an increase in gun violence, but really this was actually informed by more of a moral panic that was brought on by media exacerbation. There were a couple really highly publicized school shootings that were all over the media, and this created more of an imagined panic than a true one. As we've discussed in our class, the likelihood of a school shooting is a lot lower than it feels because of the media attention that it gets. So the idea then was to put an end to this perceived increase of gun violence in schools by adopting zero tolerance methods when it came to any misbehavior in schools. So what had previously been considered disciplinary behaviors now were really being seen as crimes because of this panic that was instilled in students, parents, faculty members, educators, everyone. So students sort of became seen as delinquents at best and criminals at worst. And it's important to recognize, too, how these zero tolerance policies, as we sort of already talked about, yes, they punished kids for more violent crimes, but they went as far as suspending and expelling students for defiant behaviors like fighting or drug and alcohol use or possession, tardiness, and even truancy, which is a big thing that we see now. During my research, I've seen a couple of examples of students being suspended or expelled for things that most of us would find really minor. Even in elementary, even in preschool classrooms, students are being expelled for things like bringing a squirt gun to school or hugging another student out of turn, things that are maybe misbehavior, but certainly not behaviors that warrant this kind of punitive action. What research has found is that these zero tolerance policies actually have no measurable impact on school safety. In fact, they're associated with a number of negative effects like school dropout rates, legal issues due to due process, and they don't create any sort of engaging atmosphere. There's no promotion of learning or opportunities creative. Really, all they're doing is sort of blurring this distinction between school and incarceration. And when we're talking about the history of the school to prison pipeline, it's really important to focus also on the history of the political and cultural demonization and criminalization of Black students, particularly young Black males. So, I mean, this is just racism that's ingrained into the United States history, but specifically focusing on young Black males. There was one incident which has become a lot more popularized now due to a Netflix series that surfaced about it. But the Central Park Five, they are known for the reported assault of a white woman in Central Park. And their media coverage, one of the terms that was sort of created by this incident was this term wilding, which was used to describe basically a pastime of young Black men. So just this one incident alone led to this ideology that young Black men are criminals or are more likely to be criminals than their white counterparts. And this ideology we see seeping into the school systems when we're looking at punitive disciplinary models that are targeting Black men, and not only young Black men, but other people of color, people with disabilities, and trans students as well. This leads us directly into another large cause of the school to prison pipeline, which is the overwhelming presence of law enforcement in schools. This plays a huge contributing role in addition to zero tolerance policies. So actually, they're really hand in hand. When schools adopted zero tolerance policies, in order to enforce them, many schools actually hired a law enforcement presence onto school grounds as well. Many states actually require educators to report student behavior directly to that law enforcement. So the intention of this is really supposed to, be to protect students, to ensure school safety. But in most cases, the involvement of law enforcement in disciplinary issues really has just been shown to escalate minor or non-violent incidents into violent incidents, criminal incidents. And this has a really negative impact on students in a number of ways. One pretty shocking or even disturbing figure is that there are almost 28,000 law enforcement officers in American public schools. A similar number is the 30,000 school children that are currently incarcerated. One report actually even found that 14 million students are in schools that are lacking counselors, nurses, psychologists, social workers, but in those schools they have an SRO or a police officer. All of this is not to dismiss the role of the SRO in schools. I do think that there's a place for law enforcement in the school systems, and I think that many SROs have a really positive effect on students, and I do think that their presence can be useful and that they do a lot of good. I am going to show a clip that I will warn is fairly disturbing. And again, it's not to be diminutive or to say that this is what law enforcement looks like in all schools all the time, but this is just a really poignant example of how a police presence in a school that is so focused on harsh punitive discipline can really, really go wrong.
Hands behind your back. Give me your hands. Give me your hands.
So that clip, it's tough to watch, but it's important because that is some students' reality, and that is what some students face when they walk into a school, when they walk into a place that is supposed to be allowing them to prosper and fostering, opportunities to learn and to grow as people. That is the reality that some students are faced with. So So now that we've heard all the bad things about the school to prison pipeline, what's causing it, how it's affecting students in our country, how do we solve it? So one proposed solution, really the only solution that has been implemented thus far in schools and begun to be studied, is restorative justice practices. We've been lucky enough in our class to have a presenter come in and talk to us and sort of walk us through some restorative practices. So we have a good understanding as a class of what they are. But just to go over it a little bit more and to get a deeper understanding, I do want to play this quick clip and then discuss a little bit more in depth how restorative justice practices look within our classrooms.
Conflict is a fact of life. Wherever we live and whoever we spend our time with, none of us can avoid it or its consequences completely. But when we ignore the complex causes of conflict, we fail to prevent it from arising again. The pain and anxiety of it lingers. Many of us have come to fear conflict. The way it makes us feel, the way it erodes our self-esteem, damages our relationships, and impacts the people around us. When conflict arises, we often focus on who is right and who is wrong, who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, who broke the rules, who should apologise and who should be punished. By using restorative approaches, we can guide those involved to a genuine and lasting resolution, while at the same time equipping them with the skills to successfully navigate conflict throughout their lives. It takes patience, skill, and empathy to involve all parties, a commitment to listening hard and seeking common ground. But through restorative approaches, you can discuss and map the key events and emotions that lead to conflict, recognise its impact on relationships, and empower everyone involved to find the best path out of it, repairing as much harm as possible on their way. You can provide them with a new perspective from which to understand how their conflict affects other people, directly and indirectly, and to see the harm that unresolved conflict can do to friendships, families, and communities. From there, the focus is on finding real solutions, not taken from a rule book, but tailored to individual needs. In schools, care homes, prisons and beyond, there is a growing recognition of the power in using restorative approaches to conflict, because it's clear that the lessons of a single conflict, creatively and successfully resolved, can change lives and last a lifetime.
That clip does a great job talking about what restorative practices are and how restorative practices can be used to resolve conflict. So that's the goal of implementing restorative justice in the school system. Restorative justice, just to give it sort of a definition, it's defined as a whole school approach. So as the clip also talked about, it's focused on inclusion in the school community as opposed to exclusion, and it's meant to address issues of student discipline, student performance, school safety, student dropouts, and the school to prison pipeline without the reliance on suspensions and expulsions. It's about building community. It's about creating a social contract between students, between faculty and staff. And rather than punishing, it's about restoring, keeping students within the classroom and mending issues from the inside out. So just for a sort of very brief history, restorative justice actually began in the early 90s with initiatives in Australia, though it has been used throughout multiple community systems, not just within the education system for many, many years. Like we talked about already a little bit, the goal is really reintegration within the community as opposed to removal from the community. And this intervention, it has steps at all levels. On a meso level, it's about action from administrators. On a macro level, it's about implementation and policy that can be district-wide, could even be nationwide eventually. And on a more micro level, it's about classroom interactions. It's about student interactions. The intervention itself actually uses a variety of methods, so community circles, like what we practiced with the presenter who came in and spoke with us, but not only circles, also mediations or conferences, but all of the practices are targeted at strengthening and repairing a sense of community, which is centered around the behavioral incident. So the behavioral incident doesn't become the issue that brings the student out of the classroom, but it's the incident that we can sort of form a community circle around. Three core principles of restorative justice are repairing the harm, stakeholder involvement, and transforming the community relationship. So the idea is to establish a rule or a sort of set of rules, a social contract. When a student misbehaves or breaks some sort of behavior, what they're doing is breaking this social contract as opposed to committing an infraction. And because this social contract has been broken, now it's the community's responsibility to help the student to repair the break. This process, although understudied, which we'll talk about more in a couple of minutes, it has been proven to prevent exclusion and recidivism, and it has also been proven to help students actually be better functioning and more productive members of the school. Also important to recognize that restorative justice practices have developed over time, and they're still really early in their development. As we know, they were just beginning to be implemented in Australia in the 90s, so they're really relatively new. They've sort of shifted over time from victim-offender mediation, so just a meeting between the victim of the behavior, the offender, and then a mediator usually facilitates that meeting. Now there's sort of a more holistic continuum. That's the model that they're operating under. It incorporates a more diverse level of formal and informal meetings, conferences, circles, like we've talked about. And it still varies from district to district, school to school, and even classroom to classroom. But in any case, the intervention, it really has to begin at a more macro or meso level. Studies find that for the implementation of restorative practice to actually be successful, there has to be a shift in value placement in the community. So this shift can be on a cultural level, on a national level, on a community level. But without that shift in the way that we actually value discipline and the way that we value restorative justice, then restorative justice can never be successful. It's about changing the way we look at punishment and changing the way we look at justice. So implementing these things then are going to take time. One researcher, actually in the articles that I included in my paper, she says that schools should envision a 3 to 5 year implementation plan that focuses on 5 key areas. So that means it can take some time to get this into schools, get this into classrooms, and actually have begin to start to see the changes taking effect, and begin to start to see the effect that this has on the phenomenon of the school to prison pipeline. That said, it's worth it. The small body of research that is out there has proven that this intervention successfully decreases suspensions, length of suspensions, and expulsions from school. It has a really positive impact on students, and it's a really culturally sensitive form of mediation or intervention. Its goal is to end a discriminatory practice, which is the school to prison pipeline, and anyone can participate. As our presenter talked about, one reservation that we had as our presenter was talking about implementing restorative practices into behavioral classrooms. We were worried about, students who have speech issues or students for whom English is not their first language. But as that presenter demonstrated, and as other classrooms have demonstrated, restorative justice practices are really inclusive, and they can incorporate all students at all levels, no matter where they stand. With that said, though, there isn't a ton of research, like I've stated, and I will talk more about. So we don't know all of the limitations to restorative justice as an intervention for the school to prison pipeline. It seems really great, and we can offer a lot of great examples, but because of the limited body of research and the fact that the research that exists has really only been done in middle class white schools, it's hard to tell where the limitations really are. I do want to show a quick clip, though, just of restorative justice in one school system, and the good it's done for that particular school. So we'll watch this quick video.
Now curbing conflicts in high school. Hari Srinivasan looks at a new approach to discipline that replaces suspensions with conversations.
In Aurora, Colorado, Principal Matthew Willis welcomes the recent changes at Hinckley High School, where 75% of the 2,000-plus students qualify for free and reduced meals. Willis says student fights are down and respect among classmates is up.
Last year we had a 48% reduction in out-of-school suspensions. When it comes to physical altercations between students, in 2007-8 we had approximately 263 physical altercations, and so far for this year we've only had 31 physical altercations.
So good morning, thank you for being here.
The turnaround, he says, began when Hinckley High started using a form of discipline called restorative justice.
Every single year over the last 3 full years that we've been doing restorative justice, you see significant declines in defiance, disobedience, and use of profanity.
This is called a talking circle, so when we have problems in the school, we come together and talk about it.
Now, when a minor altercation does occur, students, parents, and the dean face each other in a restorative circle.
Restorative is that you bring back the kids, if it's student with student, or if it's student with staff, you restore the relationship. So if there's conflict or wrongdoing, we come together and we talk about it and we try to heal the harm that was caused from the incident. So thank you for everything you said so far, and now this is...
Dean of Students Bonnie Martinez facilitates.
We speak openly and honestly, but with respect.
On the day we visited, 2 sophomore girls caught up in a physical fight were brought to a circle with their parents instead of being suspended.
So this is our talking stick. So who's ever holding this is the ones talking and everyone else is listening. You say what happened from your point of view, and you say what happened from your point of view. And sometimes we don't always agree on all the facts or whatever.
She called me the B word, and then we just started fighting.
That's kind of a liar of you. Okay. She say to be honest, and I think you have to be honest. I was here, and she come walking to me, and so she started again.
Students are asked to talk about the harm their actions may have caused, and Martinez requires everyone to sign an agreement.
What do you take responsibility for? What do you think we could do to heal the harm that was caused?
I'm sorry for having these problems that we've been having, and I don't want it to happen again.
Okay. You're not going to be enemies, but you're going to treat others with respect. That, to some people, may be viewed as a soft discipline, especially if you look at the Western culture. You know, we're about war and violence. We're not about peace and harmony. But however, for those girls to come together and for their families to come together and talk about it and to really, you know, to express truly what happened, how did it affect me and others, what am I responsible for, and how do I solve it? That's deeper than just writing up paperwork and one person goes their way and the other person goes their way and nothing was ever communicated.
What do we know about anger? It's a secondary feeling. It's a secondary feeling. What is underneath anger? A deeper emotion. A lot of deeper emotions and feelings.
At Hinckley, the restorative justice circles go beyond the dean's office. Peer mentoring classes use role-playing to teach students how to conduct circles on their own.
How does it make you feel?
It pisses me off that he's spreading rumors about me, but I didn't do nothing big.
Sophomore Nice Smith thinks the circles bring better results than suspension.
It used to be like you just get sent home for 5 days, but that doesn't resolve nothing. You just sit there and you come back with the same anger.
When teachers don't resolve the harm by doing restorative justice, then that conflict is always there. And usually what will happen is kids will just stay angry. And I don't like that teacher, and so I don't care what you say, and they'll just disrupt.
I'm deeply sorry about what's going on.
Models like Hinckley's have gained national attention after the Obama administration in January directed school districts to scrap overly zealous zero-tolerance policies that led to automatic suspensions and criminal records. Such policies, the official said, impacted minorities at higher rates. Colorado's legislature eliminated zero tolerance in schools in 2012.
The ideas of traditional discipline don't exist anymore. When in the old days, when a student or a kid got into trouble, we would spank them. And we moved away from spanking because it no longer met the values of our society. The same is true with a traditional discipline where it's all about punishment, punishment, punishment. It's not about restoring relationships. It's not about taking responsibility for your actions. It's about punishment. And so that no longer fits the society of our future. What fits the society of our future is people coming together and working and solving problems together.
Gracias. Mucho gusto. Gracias.
And while Colorado is now ahead of the national movement, the state actually played a role in the making of zero-tolerance policies after the 1999 shootings at Columbine High School.
Anytime you're in a school, you've got all these stakeholders.
Sarah Park is the director of education for the Denver Foundation, one of the sponsors of Hinckley's restorative justice program.
In Colorado, our zero-tolerance law was really in response to Columbine. And we were scared. We were all heartbroken. We were terrified, and we wanted to make sure kids were safe. And so we thought, well, let's do this. Let's make clear that this is non-negotiable. And that's really where the intention around zero tolerance came from. Unfortunately, the way it played out was in more negative educational outcomes. You can't learn if you're not there. And they also, there's studies linking suspension to incarcerations, and it's much more likely that a kid is suspended and repeatedly suspended that they'll end up in jail. And it's much more likely that if they're suspended even once in 9th grade, they're more likely to drop out.
Aurora police officer Jake Bunch, who's assigned to Hinckley High School, says social media has accelerated his need to rely on personal connections that can come from restorative justice.
With like Facebook and Twitter, information just spreads so quickly now that, you know, it's hard to stay on top of it because the kids know about something that's going to go down way before we could ever know. If kids, you know, if I build that relationship with them and they know they can come talk to me before it becomes a violent issue, it ties right in with restorative justice.
What is the role of an individual in society?
Not all conflicts can be resolved through restorative circles. Even supporters see the process as one of many approaches. And skeptics question if stopping down class time for circles limits learning. Test scores at Hinckley High School hover below the state average. For his part, Principal Willis remains a strong believer in the approach and is sharing the school's method with districts across the state.
So that clip demonstrates a great example of restorative justice in the school system and, you know, sort of the benefits of it. I did want to discuss just some other potential solutions that came up in research, though they are few and far between. Not many interventions have been proposed for this problem. But some other ones that were discussed or that have been discussed or that are starting to be implemented but haven't really been studied or tested empirically in any sort of way. These other solutions are demilitarizing school campuses, eliminating zero tolerance policies as a whole, and including government and community intervention. So demilitarizing school campuses just means taking police force and that heavy police presence off of school grounds and out of schools. Eliminating zero tolerance policies just means getting rid of the policies that cause students to be suspended, to be expelled for smaller or less severe behavioral infractions or misbehaviors. And then, of course, including government and community intervention, that looks like having more programs within and outside of schools that promote learning. So that can be public libraries, after-school programs that get students involved, that promote learning amongst students, and that help to just sort of promote a more education-fueled environment so that students have other ways to occupy their time. As I've mentioned quite a few times throughout this presentation, I really ran into a limited body of research on this intervention. It's been studied very little. The only intervention that's really been presented is restorative justice. Other interventions haven't been studied very much, or there's not a large body of research around them. So I think it's a great opportunity, though, for us as young social workers, and especially if you're interested in doing research, to sort of get your foot in the door. It's bizarre because this problem, the school to prison pipeline, it's so well known, and it's a huge topic of conversation, but I think because it's so new, and because so few interventions have been proposed, there's just not a lot out there on it. So that's something for us as young social workers to really consider, and to possibly really look into studying. And that's really all I have. So thank you so much, everyone, for watching, even if it is just Jerry who watches. It's something that will be endlessly interesting to me, and that I do have a lot of passion for. So I hope that this topic continues to be a point of conversation for the class and for the social work community in general. But that's the end. No reason why I have Plankton from SpongeBob in there. I just didn't realize how long it was going to take me to edit this video, and I'm a little tired, and that is the graphic I chose. So thank you.